Grazie.
Didn't actually put it up.
Welcome everybody to Mac's first online cheese class. Very excited for this one as we're going to taste several of my favorite cheeses and try a new one from a creamery that's in Milton, Iowa called Milton Creamery. They're a small dairy farm that also makes their own cheese as well as aged cheese. Before we get going though, I want to go over what to expect for the video. There'll be a number of topics we'll talk about prior to actually tasting. Although if you feel the need, start nibbling away. I usually do before anyone tells me I'm allowed to. But yeah, we're going to talk quickly about the creamery itself, the other cheesemakers, as well as aging cheese. We're also going to talk about how to taste cheese and the technical terms, what you're thinking of, looking for, even smelling while you're tasting cheese. So we're going to go over how to taste cheese before we actually taste cheese. And then you're going to learn specifically about each cheese itself, which I'm very excited about because these are two of the three my favorite cheeses from Milton Creamery, and very excited to try the Gouda as well. We'll also talk a little bit about what makes a cheddar and what makes a Gouda a Gouda. These are two very different styles and processes of making cheese, which greatly affect the ultimate cheese product itself. So we'll learn a bit more about those. And then we'll talk a bit about pairings afterwards, and how you can pair based on your own likes or styles of cheese that you're tasting. Okay, let's get going. So Milton Creamery is owned and operated by Rufus and Jane Musser. They've been in the farming world for many, many years, mainly starting with vegetables and food before shifting over to a dairy farm and then eventually becoming a cheesemaker. They had wanted to create a business that not only helped their own success, but wanting to support the local communities that they also served. All of their milk and cheese comes from locally sourced dairy farms. And when I say locally, I mean less than 30 miles from their farm. They're also strong believers in no growth hormones and believe strongly that the quality of milk determines the quality of the cheese. It was 2006 when they made their first cheese, and 2009 when they won their first award. Best of class hard cheese in an open category at the U.S. cheese competitions. From there, they have only grown, taken many more awards, and in this year, 2020, they just opened a 17,000 square foot facility to age 1.5 million pounds of cheese. So how do we taste cheese? When we're tasting cheese for learning or education, we want to do it with intention. And with that, we want to be thinking about three things while we're tasting. What does it look like? What does it smell like? And what does it taste like, of course? When we're looking at a cheese, we're looking at a number of different aspects. We're looking at the rind, we're looking at the paste, we're looking for color, we're looking for mold, if it's supposed to be there, not supposed to be there, any unusual fissures or holes. All of these things will help tell you a little bit about the cheese, and possibly tell you a bit about the milk itself. Not always, because cheesemakers can add ingredients that will change the look of a cheese. And age will also change the look of a cheese as well. But mainly, you're looking for texture, density, color when you're looking at a cheese. The second piece is smelling. The couple things about smell, two rules is stinky does not mean spoiled. Stinky cheese, a lot of people love stinky cheese, and a lot of people can be put off by that. I've found that almost like a dog's bark and bite might not be the same, a cheese's smell and taste might not be the same. So don't be put off potentially by the smell when the taste can be a bit different than the nose. The other rule is cold cheese doesn't emit its full flavor. So if you are smelling cold cheese or tasting cold cheese, one trick is to break it up in your hands, kind of put it in your palm for a moment, or if you do eat it, take a bite, let it sit on the palate for a little bit to allow that full flavor to arise in there. And when you do, take a nice big full sniff and exhale through the nose to allow a lot of the various aspects of the flavors to fully emerge. Lastly, you're going to be tasting. The finish of the cheese is really going to be where a lot of the flavor and full flavor is. So sometimes it may take 5, 10, 30 seconds for that flavor to emerge completely as you are tasting. But every time you are about to taste, just take a second, take a look at it, take a smell, see if you can get any clues as to what it may be, milk type, style of cheese. So now that we know how to taste, let's take a minute and learn about what we're tasting, and learn really what makes a cheddar and a Gouda a Gouda. So, what makes a cheddar a cheddar? So, cheddar cheese comes from a process of cheddarizing the cheese, and we'll get into that in a second. But it originally came from the village of Cheddar in Somerset in southwest England. It is not protected like brie or manchego, but it is more about the process of making the cheese than it is the location and the selection of milk and recipe, so on and so forth. Many cheesemakers do make a version of a cheddar themselves, and these vary greatly as the number of dairies and creameries that are making a cheddar cheese. So again, cheddar starts off like most cheeses, where the milk goes in the vat, you add the rennet and any enzymes that you want for the flavoring. And then once you've added the rennet and the curd sets, you're then going to start cutting the curds, as you see in the picture here. What they'll eventually do is cut the entire vat of curd, making sure they get to the specific size that they want to do. Again, you can take the same milk, make 100 different styles of cheese from it, and most cheeses start off in the same process of adding the rennet, adding your enzymes with the milk, and then stirring, and like any recipe, adding temperature and time will greatly impact the curd itself. They're also going to add a certain amount of rennet. The more you add, the firmer the cheese will be, the less obviously the softer the curd will be. But one bigger difference between a lot of cheeses and cheddar is how after they cut the curd, they'll then cook the curd. They'll bring the temperature of the vat and the milk back up. This here is a picture of that curd cooking. You can see a lot of the whey and the curd mixing. This is exactly what they want to do. And once it reaches a certain temperature and again time, they're looking at acidity level within the curd. They will then stop cooking. Once the curd has been cooked and the whey has been drained, they will then transfer the curds into these sections and blocks. And this is where the cheddaring process starts to begin. The whey is continuing to be expelled from the curds, but they'll start cutting and stacking the cheese itself on top of each other. This helps assist in expelling the whey from the curd. And you can see here they'll just stack and stack and restack over and over until they get most of the whey out of these giant cheddar blocks. Once they've reduced the amount of whey that they want, they'll then put them into the molds, the giant block cheese molds. And from here, they'll salt it, and then after a couple days, they will then put it into the caves where it will age, depending on how long they want to have it for, several months up to several years. So now that we know a little bit about the cheddar process, the next step is the forming and aging of the cheese. So again, we've got two different styles here. We have a cloth-bound cheddar with the Florese truckle, and we have the block cheddar with the Prairie Brise. Both of these are very delicious cheeses, some of my favorite cheddars, but are very different. So the two cheeses we're looking at is the Florese truckle and the Prairie Brise. Florese truckle is going to be different in a number of different ways. Mainly, it is a cloth-bound cheddar that's aged for a year using raw milk versus the Prairie Brise, which is only aged for about 9 months and is a traditional block cheddar. There is no rind on the block cheddar, and the rind on the Florese is definitely going to add a lot more flavor to the cheese. And the closer you look to the edge of that cheese, you will definitely see a little more coloring or discolorization, and that is from the rind and the aging process. The longer this ages, the more that is going to penetrate into the paste of the cheese and get a bit more flavor in there than you would from a younger cheese, where your block cheddar is going to be uniformed all throughout. So no matter where you eat and bite on that cheese, it should taste the same. The closer the rind you get on the Florese, more intense flavor will emerge, and a bit more bitterness as you get closer to the rind. So what makes Gouda a Gouda? As you probably guessed, it's the process of how they make the cheese itself. Gouda actually doesn't come from the town the cheese is made. It comes from the town that the cheese is sold. So this is a picture of the town itself, where makers of Gouda will arrive with their cheeses, haggle with buyers with an old clapping, yelling of prices process until they agree on a price, and it gets taken off to be weighed and finish the sale. But the big difference in the cheese making is after the curds are drained of the whey, they will wash the curds again in water. This process of washing the curds is actually said to give the curd a bit more of a sweetness to the flavor, hence why Goudas tend to be nice and sweet in taste. The other major difference with Gouda is that the rind is made of wax. So they take the cheese once it's formed in its molds and it's been brined or salted. They'll then dip the entire wheel in wax. The wax helps protect the cheese as it ages, flavoring from the inside out. Okay, now that we know a little bit about how to taste and the different styles of cheeses that we're tasting, let's get right into actually tasting, if you have any cheese left, that is. With cheese, just like wine, when you're tasting or sampling, you want to kind of work your way up to stronger and stronger cheeses. We always say behind the counter that if you want to taste blues, that's great. We just want to start with something else first. Otherwise, everything is going to taste like blue cheese. So for us, that we're going to start with the cheddars. and work our way to the Gouda. So first up, we have our block of Prairie Breeze. Now, one quick thing I want to talk about cheese and tasting before we get started is facing a cheese. So when you are tasting a cheese, what you want to do is basically scrape off just a little layer off of the edge of the cheese. So if you can see on the Prairie Breeze, when you first unpack it, it's going to have this sheen on it, a shear, and that just means it hasn't been faced or it hasn't been cut fresh. And you'll tend to get this from supermarket cheese or anything that's been wrapped or not been opened anytime recently. Some people don't mind this on their cheese and don't even really notice a difference in the flavor or the taste because it's kind of getting mixed up completely. But a little experiment you can do is you just want to take a nice little soft edge knife and just gently scrape off of the top layer. And you're going to see, if you do this, how that sheen kind of comes off. You'll see, let me see if I can get the angle right. You can see a little edge. So a little edge right about there where it still has a sheen over here. And in here, it not as much. A little edge right there. You can see the scraping edges. Sorry, I'm trying to figure out the camera here. But basically, if you scrape this and you take off that layer, it's going to take off a little bit of that bitterness. So if sometimes you find that the cheese you're tasting is a little bitter, it might just be because you have that shiny shear on the edge. Now what you can do, and I do this with new cheesemongers as well, is take the scrapings that you just took off of that cheese and taste it side by side with some cheese under that sheen. And you might notice that slight bitterness change. Otherwise, again, it's kind of hard to taste straight. Otherwise, again, when you get it, you want to take a look at it. What's the coloring on it? Is it white? Is it straw? Is it orange? What does it smell like? Oh, I love Prairie Breeze. This, get a little sweetness in the smell. And again, I kind of know, but this cheddar definitely is a nice, sweet, young block cheddar. So you're going to break it open, give it a smell, give it a taste. Right away, I get that sweetness on the tip, almost a little pineapple-y. Starts to get a little sharp at the end. You can kind of start to feel it in the back of the mouth. I also tasted a little bit of crunchiness. If when you taste this, you might notice a tiny bit of crunchy. That's not salt. That's the tyrosine crystals. This is a breakdown of proteins. As the cheese ages, these proteins start to form. So that's something that you'll notice in cheese or not notice in cheese. And a lot of people love that crystally, crunchy bite in the cheese. So the longer a cheese is aged, typically you're going to get more and bigger of those crunchy pieces of tyrosine crystals in your cheese. But this cheese is a crumbly block cheddar. Another cool thing is sometimes when you look at the entire block, you'll see the little formations of curds in there. So you'll see like a little puzzle, almost puzzle pieces in there when you're looking at a block cheddar. But this one's creamy. It is crumbly as well, so it crumbles like a cheddar, but it's going to be really creamy as a texture in the mouth. One cheese I really, 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 really love. So the next cheese we're going to taste is the Fleury's Truckle. So again, this is a cheddar, but it's a cloth-bound cheddar, and that's going to change the texture and the flavor quite a bit. when you are tasting. The other thing you're going to notice is the color difference. So kind of hard in this light, but you notice the Prairie Breeze is much brighter and lighter, and the Florey's Truckle is definitely a little more straw hay color. They have taken off the cloth on this. You don't want to eat cheesecloth. It's not very tasty at all. But again, as I noted before, the closer you get to the edge and the rind, the stronger flavor and even more bitter you will get in the taste of the cheese. So the closer you get to the center, the creamier and less strong on these aged cheeses. But the Florey's Truckle, it is aged for 1 year. It is a raw cow's milk cheese. So I find that raw milk cheeses have a lot more complexity to the flavor. So when they pasteurize milk, they get rid of the bad bacteria, but they also get rid of the good bacteria as well, which provides a lot of flavor. Jasper Hill's owner, head cheesemaker, says if you pasteurize your cheese, you're hiding something from your milk. So a lot of cheese aficionados really look for raw milk cheeses, as they will be a lot more complex in flavor. But when we look at this, we can see the straw. We can tell it's a firm cheese. It's not as crumbly, but it definitely crumbles as that block cheddar. And smelling, it's not going to be as sweet. I'm not getting that sweetness. I'm getting a little bit of earthiness, grassiness. When I'm tasting, it's definitely not as creamy. It's a little drier. Again, it's aged almost a year, so several months older. But again, the cloth bound factor creates a little bit drier, comes across a little older. And the truckle, so truckle comes from a term of an old world style of aging it in a cylinder that's called a truckle cylinder. So it's about 1.5 feet tall and about 1 foot wide. And aging cheese in this size mold, they learned it comes across as an older cheese than what it really is. So it's only a year, but it stands up and compares to several other cloth-bound cheeses or other cheeses that can seem a year or 2 years older than the Florey's Truckle. This one has a little bit of spiciness to it, a little peppery to it, along with that grassiness to it as well. So the Florey's Truckle, really nice cheddar, a little more savory, a little more umami, not nearly as sweet as the Prairie Breeze, but another cheddar that is just really delicious. And the longer it sits on your palate, the more flavors you're going to get from that. And it's just going to keep playing along. Again, I think this lends itself to more of the raw milk cheeses are just going to linger more and have a lot more flavor. Okay, so our last cheese we're going to taste, last but definitely not least, is the aged Gouda. So this is a Gouda from Frisian Farms, close to Milton Creamery. Again, needs to be within 30 miles. And these guys make the Gouda and then send it to Milton Creamery for aging. So this is where sometimes there's a debate between cheesemakers and affineurs, folks that age the cheese. But this is something that Milton Creamery and a number of other creameries and farms and dairies are starting to do, is realizing that aging cheese can be a whole nother aspect of the cheese world as opposed to just making the cheese. Some people argue that it's more the affineur who brings that cheese up to flavor and able to get it to the market at the right time. And others argue that it's the cheese maker that makes the cheese, which is the most important. I don't think they can live without each other, so I think they're pretty much both on the top of the list. And doing both myself, I find they're both very important. If you mess up in the cheese making process, that can ruin an entire batch of cheese. To where affinage, you're looking at cheese almost on a weekly basis. And so it's more of the affineur's fault if something happens to the cheese or something out of their control within the cave. If the temperature changes dramatically or if the humidity level changes dramatically, this can definitely have an impact. But it's a lot more forgiving in the cave, as it's almost like geologic time. Everything happens slowly over time inside the caves. And so keeping an eye on those cheeses and taking care of them is very important. But the aging process is definitely another level of cheese, the cheese industry. And Milton Creamery does a great job of aging some of the cheeses. So Sneak is a aged Gouda that's aged for 1,000 days, which is almost 3 years of aging. This process, as we talked a little bit before about aging, is going to intensify the flavors of the cheeses over time. It also is going to dry the cheese out. So the older the cheese you have, typically the drier the cheese is going to be. You don't see very many old bries because they're going to go bad after a month or so. But aged cheddars, Goudas, and tomes will just give you a much deeper flavor of cheese. If you already nibbled on this one, you're going to know and tell right away the texture is a lot drier. It is a lot more crumbly, and that is again from the age and the dryness. But the other thing you should notice when you're looking at this cheese, again, we're going to look before we smell, before we taste. But if you look at the cheese, you're going to notice all these like white flakes on the cheese. This is that tyrosine crystals. So this is the fat and the proteins breaking down and breaking those chains as the cheese age and creating these crystals. So we tasted some of that in Prairie Breeze and a little bit in the Fleury's Truckle. You're going to get a lot of it here in the Gouda, this nice aged Gouda. So looking at it, I'll see the firmness, that crumbliness, the tyrosine crystals, and then give it a smell. And even on the nose, I like to break the cheese because that's going to give me the freshest smell of the paste. Even a minute out, the oxygen is going to be drying up and trying to create a rind on the edge of this cheese. So breaking it and giving it a nice smell will give you that freshest flavor. I'm definitely getting some of that sweetness. One thing that I really love about Goudas is the sweetness and the cheese. I tend to lean towards the sweet, and Becky tends to lean towards the salty and the umami. So we make a nice pair. But this one, definitely get that crunchy tyrosine almost right away. The sweetness comes over time. So I get this nice savory flavor, but the more it expands into my mouth, on my cheeks, I definitely get that creaminess. Even though it's a dry, crumbly cheese, it almost melts in your mouth. And then you start to get a lot of that sweetness in the back of your mouth and at the end of the flavor. So this is one where over time, this cheese is definitely going to develop and sweeten as you taste. This is a great Gouda. I really like this one. So now that we've tasted cheese and we learned a little bit about cheese, we want to talk a little bit about pairings with cheese. This really comes down to the individual, and we can tell you a little bit of general what pairs typically with cheddars and Goudas. So when it comes to pairings, I find this to be very subjective. Um, there are traditional pairings that you can look to and get, like dried fruits, nuts, chocolates, things like this are very easy to pair and go with. Other cheeses definitely have and like pairings to go with. This tends to be kind of where the cheeses were originally born. Um, so I find manchego with a nice Spanish ham to be a classic combination. Manchego also with uh, some jams or fruits, such as a quince paste, is a very traditional Spanish pairing as well. So you'll find that those pairings tend to work well together. But it's really up to you what you like to have with your cheeses. We tend to try and have a variety: dried fruit, some nuts, either candied or salted, um, and then some basic crackers or bread. One of the things we try and do with crackers is get more plain, just sea salt crackers, and just plain bread, so that we're not overwhelming the flavor of the cheese with the flavor of the crackers. This can change depending on the cheese. So if you have a younger, um, somewhat minimum flavor of a cheese, you can go with a cracker that maybe has nuts or fruit in it, or a flavored cracker, like rosemary, to allow those flavors and the textures of the cheese play together. But you want to avoid, or I should say, you want to allow the cheese to speak for itself. So the stronger the cracker, or the vehicle for bringing the cheese to you, is going to change the flavor and the profile of the cheese itself. So when we look to pair, we're looking for a plain salt cracker, sea salt cracker, or just bread itself. And mostly cheeses are just really good on their own. You don't need anything to pair with it, or a vehicle to eat it with. But pairings can elevate or negate the flavor of the cheese. When we do pairings, we're always trying to think about either a plus one or a plus two, or a -1, -2, or a 0. And what I mean by that is, when you put two together, do either of those things get better? Do both get better? Or does it get worse, in flavor? So if one of the two pairings gets better, that's a +1. If the cheese and the pairing you're eating both get better, that's a +2. And then again, negative that if it's making it worse. So for me, pairing anything super umami or sour with a cheese is going to bring it down in my book. But it's not for everybody. That's why it's very subjective. When thinking about drinks to pair with your cheese, um, again, this is a little bit of a subjective process. Uh, but you will find that when you are having your drinks with the cheese, both will change. I remember taking a beer and cheddar class, or beer and cheese class, in Boston not too long ago. And when I got the menu of the beers, I was very disappointed, because they had a lot of styles that I don't like drinking very much at all, including sours and wit beers. But when I had them with the cheese, it changed dramatically, and I was actually impressed with some of the beers that I was tasting. So play around with your drinks and your pairings, and you may find that certain things work well and others don't. In general, though, cheddar kind of grew up in old world, UK, for generations and generations. And they also made a lot of beer and a lot of mead and a lot of cider. So one thing you may find with pairings with cheese and with drinks is, um, again, what's coming from that region. So they tend to have made things that go well together. So ciders and beers typically will pair nicely with cheeses. Again, it's up to you whether you like lighter beers, darker beers, but you really want to kind of find something that matches the intensity. So if you have a nice light cheddar, you don't necessarily want to go with a big porter or a stout, but you may find that that works well. So I don't like putting lots of rules on what you can pair, what you can drink with your cheeses. Um, you will find though that again, the stronger drinks can overpower the weaker cheeses and vice versa. So be aware of that as you are pairing. And when you're doing something like this class, it's fun to get a variety of drinks to pair with. So I think we're planning on having a couple, 2 or 3 different ciders to try, as well as 1 or 2 wines that we're going to try as well. And for fun, I think we're going to look at a white and a red in the wine category, as well as a couple different styles of cider. But again, we'll check in when we do a check in before the concert, and we will see what everybody's tasting and trying to go with these cheeses. One thing I do also like with the Goudas, since it is very sweet and has this nice strong caramelly flavor, I find whiskey or bourbon or Scotch, not so much Scotch, but whiskey or bourbon that goes really nicely with the Gouda. Again, matching that caramel flavors together is really nice. So I know we have a little bit of Irish whiskey that we like that we'll probably have a little finger of to go with the Gouda. So there you have it. I hope you enjoyed this online class, this video, and we'll see you next time. Thanks.